Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was My Head is an Animal with Dirty Paws. And on today's show, I am talking about a recent scientific study that looked at how zoos work in terms of fostering conservation activities in people. And it was kind of an interesting paper. It's quite a long paper, but it looks at how people feel and what sorts of attitudes they have when they go into zoos, how that impacts what their experience is at the zoo. Also, how does the zoo display impact their experience there? How does that affect their ability to learn from the experience? And then how does all of that go on to kind of link in the zoo experience with some sort of a conservation initiative or desire? And this is kind of a timely topic because lots of people are saying that the function of zoos in the modern world is changing quite a lot, because in the past it used to be that we would see these exotic things from distant lands that we've never seen in any other place. And that was what a zoo was for, to kind of put on show these strange and wonderful things from distant lands. But of course, now a lot of us have seen these on the internet, we've seen them on television, we have access to these sorts of things in lots of different venues, although of course those aren't necessarily up close and personal. So zoos might not exactly have that same kind of wow factor that they used to have, although they do have the ability, like no other place really, to offer you that kind of up close and personal interaction with certain things that are quite rare or quite dangerous that you wouldn't necessarily get to interact with in the wild. And zoos also have this wonderful function of being able to put these things in a place where they can be monitored, their genes can be taken for use in breeding programs, we can breed them in captivity and maybe put them back in the wild. So there are potential ways that zoos can be used quite directly with the animals, and also indirectly by influencing how people think about animals and wildlife, and whether they're interested then, once they kind of see these things in situ. I don't know if in situ is quite the right term there, because maybe in situ is out in nature, but they see them in captivity and then apply that kind of emotional response to them to the same animals out in the wild, and maybe even to other animals and to the habitats and ecosystems of all these individuals. So what these guys wanted to do was look at all of this, this variation in opinions surrounding what are zoos for, how well do they serve these different functions, and think about, can we use these things as a real tool to change the way people feel about wildlife, and to then have that go on and change their behaviors. And the paper starts with a really interesting quotation from Desmond Morris, the naturalist, who said, when describing his very first visit to a zoo, that it did more for his later interest in animals than 100 films or 1,000 books, and that was because the animals were both real and near. And so this is one of the kind of central things that the authors of the paper wanted to look at. Does this kind of up-close and personal experience have a different sort of impact on you than you might have with animals out in the wild, for instance, if you're just taking a hike, or if you were to pull them up on the internet and maybe watch a clip of David Attenborough on YouTube? Now in the US alone, and that's where these authors were from, they said that zoos and aquaria are visited by about 140 million people per year. So this is not an insubstantial number of people that go to see animals in captivity. And of course, if you were to add in Europeans, Africans, Asian, this number would obviously grow quite a bit larger. So that means that there are a lot of people that can potentially be educated, inspired, and feel connections to the natural world because of these visits that they make to see animals in captivity. And in the past, there have been lots of different studies to try to understand how these sorts of captive environments affect the people that visit them, and how they kind of facilitate, or whether they do at all, interactions between humans and animals. And most people surveyed have previously indicated that they go to the zoo not for education purposes, which is what a lot of people kind of, I think, hope, that you go to the zoo to learn, but in fact they go simply for entertainment. However, this is a little bit different when we're thinking about people who have kids, because the one group of people who seem to think of education when they think of zoos are people who have children that they want to take out and give a kind of a learning experience to. Zoos are good and they're valued for providing an outdoor experience, because even though some of them have enclosures, they do often have outdoor enclosures, allowing families to do something together as a group, facilitating social interactions, and also facilitating learning experiences. And these are the things that are most commonly mentioned whenever people are asked why it is they want to go to a zoo. But they do also have a recognized conservation value, and that's the case even if visitors themselves aren't aware of it. So there have been studies that find that people who visit zoos do have some kind of impacts later on how they think and how they respond to conservation initiatives. But the visitors themselves might not even be able to tell you that if you walk up to them at the end of their visit and say, has this affected your conservation sense? They might not realize it, but kind of subtly there probably are some things going on while they're there. And conservation awareness may not necessarily follow simply because of education about wildlife and about nature in the zoos. There can be lots of other things that are happening that can influence this kind of response. And in particular, two things that really matter are strength of emotion and also moral conviction. So these have previously been found to facilitate both greater concern and also greater respect for nature, and as a result of this, to produce greater willingness to participate in conservation activities. So, if we want zoos to have this kind of conservation purpose, we want to ensure that the zoo experiences are kind of setting people up to have this kind of strong emotional reaction and also feel kind of morally right about what they're doing. And this would lead to an enhanced awareness, hopefully, of the natural world. And this is associated with lots of factors, and some of these are under control of the people who design the zoos and design the exhibits, and some of them are completely out of their control. So for example, one of the big things that impacts your kind of response to a zoo and your kind of conservation response as well is who you are. So what's your socioeconomic status? What's your age? What's your gender? For example, women tend to identify more strongly with animals in general, and women tend to respond to them with more emotion and also more sympathy. Children and young adults, on the other hand, if you're thinking about another type of interaction, they tend to have a greater concern for animal welfare and be quite tuned in with how happy or unhappy the animals are. Another important factor is what visitors already know. So when they come into the zoo, how much have they already learned previously, and how much do they therefore bring to that habitat? What's their familiarity with the environmental issues of the day? What's their previous experience with nature? Are they big hikers, or are they kind of couch potatoes who would rather play PlayStation all day? Another important factor is what animals are they seeing when they get there? So for example, are these animals phylogenetically similar to humans? So are we talking about chimps and gorillas, or are we talking about snakes and cockroaches? And obviously people tend to be drawn towards things that are more like them in some way or another. Other things that affect the kind of the human perception of the animals that they're seeing: body size, rarity. So people have more positive attitudes towards more familiar species. So mammals are more familiar. Tigers, for example, elephants, we know those things better than maybe a bandicoot or a porcupine. I don't know, I'm just kind of guessing at what animals might be familiar, but you get the idea. So if you've never heard of it before, you might respond quite differently to it than if it's a species that you have seen quite often on TV and you've kind of watched it doing funny little cute things, and you therefore want to go check it out in person. Another big influence is cultural stereotypes. So, in our environment, there are certain animals that do have stigmas associated with them, or that are perceived as being particularly pleasant. Who doesn't love a hedgehog, for example? It would be hard to have a display of hedgehogs that didn't excite people and draw their interest. Whereas, on the other hand, snakes tend to be kind of universally reviled and kind of repugnant to people, and so it can be a bit more difficult to get a lot of excitement about those types of animals. Now, obviously, that isn't a blanket statement. There are lots of people who dislike hedgehogs, I'm sure, and love snakes, but you get the idea. The type of animal is going to impact how closely you relate to that exhibit that you're looking at. You also have to think about the animal husbandry and exhibit practices. If you've ever gone to a zoo and you've watched an animal in a very small enclosure that just kind of paces around and around, that can be really painful. One of the reasons I stopped going to zoos actually was that even in the nicest ones, I could really easily see that there were animals that were distressed by being in captivity. You could always find at least one exhibit that wasn't really ideal for the animals that were enclosed there, and so it was quite unpleasant, and it was just really hard to see all of that. And other visitors, even ones that don't have kind of a good knowledge of biology, they still can see these sorts of things. They can pick up on the little cues. And so it is important to notice whether the animals are being active, whether there's a nice environment, whether there's a lot of enrichment for them. And in general, when animals do display a lot of behavioral diversity, visitors seem to think that that's quite a positive thing. It makes their own experience better because they feel that the animals are enjoying themselves more. Another kind of interesting thing to think about is whether the layout of the exhibit or the display, because this includes museums as well as zoos, is didactic or whether it's naturalistic. So a didactic one would be one that seeks to teach in some way. So for example, maybe you've got a bunch of specimens that are grouped by taxonomic relationships. So you've got all of the butterflies in a certain genus in one place together. Or maybe you've got a display that talks about how animals feed, and so you've got a bunch of different animals, but they're all in a feeding position or all in a feeding scenario, so you can kind of compare and contrast. So that one is explicitly designed to teach you something. On the other hand, you might have a more naturalistic one. So you've got kind of a savanna type setup with lots of grasses and maybe a nice high rise of rock where you've got the lions roaming around in what looks very much like their natural habitat. They might lie out on that rock to sun themselves and relax, and all of that seems very much like you're visiting them in the savannah in Africa, and so that kind of elicits an entirely different emotion. You're not necessarily learning about them in quite the same way, but you're kind of experiencing life as they experience it in the wild, so that elicits more emotion, and it kind of maybe triggers a bit more imagination because it's presenting you with this kind of diorama type situation. So those sorts of little subtle things can have a big impact on your experience in a zoo. And finally, another really big factor is how close you can get. People tend to enjoy exhibits a lot more when they can get right up next to an animal. And that is in part, I think, because they're trying to have a connection with that animal. And in particular, and I'll talk about this a bit later, if they can get near enough to make eye contact and maybe even get the animal to respond to them in some way, that really is something that can seal the deal and make that experience at the zoo a really powerful one. So all of these sorts of features and characteristics are really important to consider when you're designing a zoo and bringing in visitors, because emotion and learning are interrelated, and they therefore this therefore means that a positive zoo experience can have a really big impact on what information people take away and how that influences their actions later on in life. And emotion influences what people consider important. So when they're feeling kind of into the whole scene and when their curiosity is increased, they're more willing to learn, they're more likely to retain facts. And when this emotional state is positive, they're therefore more likely to engage in what researchers refer to as self-directed learning, and active engagement with the environment. And self-directed learning is basically, when you are taking control of what you're doing in an area and actually actively going out and seeking information. So a lot of people, they might go to a museum or a zoo and just kind of wander around and see the animals and then head out again. Other people will go from plaque to plaque and display and read every single word that's on the wall. And those people are the ones that are engaging in self-directed learning. They're actively pursuing all of the knowledge that's available to them in that area, and they're sucking it all up and then leaving with it. And hopefully, if you're a zookeeper and you go through all the work of putting out a display, those are the sorts of people that you're getting, because you want them to read all of the stuff that you're putting out there for them. So all of this background sets up the current study. And what these guys were interested in doing in their report was exploring the relationship between a visitor's emotional response to a zoo exhibit, the variables that impact that response, and also the visitor's reports of conservation-mindedness following the visit to that exhibit. So these guys also took into account not just what was happening on the day of the visit, but what sorts of factors, what sorts of characteristics that people had when they visited. So what was their gender, their age, what was the kind of setup of the exhibit itself, what were the animals that they were looking at, what were the animal behaviors, a whole bunch of different things that could influence this interaction between the people in the zoo. Now they hypothesized several different things. First of all, they thought that visitors would be more conservation-minded if they had previous orientations towards nature. So if these are people who were kind of really into the hiking scene or birding a whole lot, or if they come to zoos often, these are the types of people that might have a stronger response because they're already kind of interested in animals. They don't just happen to find themselves there at the zoo for no reason. They also hypothesized that the strength of the emotional response that these visitors had to the animals would be impacted by their gender, their age, the species of animal being observed, and also the types of behaviors in which the animals were engaging during the visit. They suggested that behavioral diversity would also be increased via environmental enrichment, so they looked at displays that had no enrichment, and then they went and put some enrichment in, and then looked at those displays all over again in order to see how visitors' responses and also the animals themselves, how those changed from the kind of the baseline to the enrichment stage. Now they compared exhibits of 3 different animals: tigers, hyenas, and African wild dogs. Now tigers, of course, are large, they're quite familiar to most people. Most people tend to think they're very pretty, they're highly endangered, and cumulatively all of these traits suggest that they are the most likely animal to provoke a positive response in the human visitors. Wild dogs are kind of a moderate size. They are endangered, but they're not quite as endangered as tigers. They're not quite as familiar, so they would produce potentially kind of a neutral or intermediate response in people. And finally, hyenas are also moderate sized. They're not generally considered all that attractive. In fact, most people tend to think they're quite ugly, and they're not endangered whatsoever. They tend to have kind of a cultural stigma attached to them, actually, because they are scavengers and hunters, and they're kind of scary. You know, they're in the Lion King in a not very favorable way. And so the authors suggested that these guys would be most likely to provoke negative responses. And just after the break, I will talk about the methods that they used to look into these different hypotheses and what they found. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Survivor with Eye of the Tiger. And on today's show, I am talking about a recent study where a group of scientists looked into the reactions of visitors to zoos. And they were looking at different types of zoo exhibits, different types of animals that were involved, and also different characteristics in the visitors themselves. And they were trying to figure out how all of these things interacted to produce an effect of kind of influencing the education of the visitors and also their conservation mindedness. Just before the break, I was talking about the background and also the hypotheses that the authors had, and now I want to talk about their methods. So they conducted their study at the Wildlife Conservation Society's Bronx Zoo in New York City in the U.S. And they looked at, as I said before the break, 3 different species of animals: tigers, wild dogs, and hyenas. And each of these were housed in different exhibits. So the tigers were in a place called Tiger Mountain, which housed 11 tigers and included also some educational pavilions, an information board with interactive touchscreens, additional displays, that basically, all these little things are having lots of different information about tigers, as well as the tigers themselves. So the visitors had lots of different ways to find out stuff about these animals. The pack of African wild dogs included 12 individuals, and it was in a naturalistic exhibit that was bordered by a visitor pathway, so visitors could go all around the edge and kind of look in to try to find the wild dogs. And there was also a viewing pavilion on the enclosure, so that they could kind of get up above and look down and to see where the wild dogs were. And finally, the hyena exhibit involved 2 hyenas that were viewable from 3 different vantage points, both through windows and overhead on a deck, so people could see them at varying distances. And often the hyenas were right next to kind of a balcony type situation, so that people could get quite close to them. Now they were able to get 408 different people to fill out a survey while they were visiting the zoo. A little over half of these were female and the rest were male, and they ranged in age from 18 to 100 years old, which is really impressive, I have to say, for a 100-year-old to be out visiting the zoo. The mean age, though, was 43, which I think kind of suggests that you've got a lot of parents and grandparents here probably taking their little kids to the zoo. And they tried to spread these surveys evenly across the different exhibits. So as I mentioned before the break, they had kind of a baseline exhibit, and then they also added enrichment and went back to those same exhibits to look at how the animals behaved differently and how visitors responded differently when the animals were able to interact with something that had been put in the enclosure. So they had the tigers, baseline and enriched, they had 84 and 81 surveys. For the wild dogs, they had 50 and 68 surveys. And for the hyenas, they had 45 and 80. So they did a pretty good job of getting lots of different surveys from all of the different types of scenarios that they could examine here. So their data collection occurred on both weekends and weekdays, and they had kind of a morning period and also an afternoon period when they went to visit. And what they did was they found visitors that were at each of these different enclosures, and they approached them and asked them if they would fill out a written survey that usually took about 5 to 10 minutes. And every time I read something like this in the paper, I always think, I am one of those people that sees someone like this coming and immediately runs off because I don't want a stranger to talk to me. But sometimes you've got these people who are actually collecting really important data, and they just happen to be out in public with a clipboard, and they look a bit sketchy, like maybe they're going to ask you for money or try to get your email address, but actually they're doing something really good and really useful. So every time I read this, I think, next time, I'm not going to avoid those people, I'm going to try to help them out. But in any case, they did get quite a lot of people that were willing to help them out, luckily. Luckily, I wasn't one of the ones there, it was someone more willing. And they adapted for their use a survey that had formerly been used in another study on zoo visitation. So basically they were looking at kind of three general categories of question. They wanted to get an idea of how many animal behaviors the visitors observed. They wanted to know how the visitors responded emotionally to those behaviors, and they wanted to know how the visitors felt about conservation. And then they kind of were able to do statistical analyses that related these three broad categories of information. And the questions were evaluated using 12 close-ended questions within on the survey that were divided into 41 different items across seven different sections. So they had lots of different categories that the people could choose from and kind of sub-questions of major questions. And basically the visitors had this 7-point scale that they could use to rate the different responses and conservation implications to all of these different factors. So the scale had not at all on one end and very much so on the right. So it was kind of a question, like, did you see, it would be like a true-false type statement. So there were lots of animal behaviors that I observed today. And so on one end it would be, not at all, I didn't see any animal behaviors. On the other end it would be very much so, I saw lots of animal behaviors. So it was just a series of questions like that. And then, as I said earlier, they did have this environmental enrichment as well. So the baseline conditions involved animals being in their enclosures under regular conditions with absolutely no enrichment. So they're just hanging out, probably napping. They might be eating at that time or drinking water, but basically it's completely up to the animals to just do whatever they would do regularly in the zoo. But in the enrichment conditions, they provided the animals something that wouldn't ordinarily be within their enclosure. And they did this at the beginning of each survey session. And they either used foods, so things like blood balls, bones, and fish, or they used occupational objects, so things like cardboard boxes and paper that they might explore, investigate, play with, who knows what they were doing. So they did this for approximately half of their surveys, and then got visitors to respond to how they felt about that, and then compared those sorts of responses to the ones from visitors who didn't see any of these sorts of enrichment activities at all. And that pretty much summarizes all they did. It was a pretty simple survey, to be honest, and I will have another music break here, and then just afterwards tell you what the researchers found. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was Grimes with Visiting Statue. And on today's show I am talking about a recent scientific study exploring how people react to zoo displays and whether they pick up information there that they then can use to become more engaged in conservation. So just before the break I was talking about the methods used in this study, and now I want to get to the heart of the matter, which is the results. So the researchers first did a statistical analysis that I've talked about before on the show called a principal components analysis. And basically what this does is it takes a lot of different variables that you've collected information on, and it looks at how these things are related, and it can condense them down into a smaller number of variables so that your analyses aren't so unwieldy. Excuse me. So what they did was they performed this principal component analysis on the three different broad categories of things that they collected data on: the predispositions of their visitors, the emotional responses of their visitors, and also the conservation mindedness of their visitors. And the principal components, they had basically one for each one of these that explained quite a lot of the variation from one person to the next. And each one of these explained over 50%, which actually means it's quite a powerful thing. It is picking up on a lot of the interrelatedness of the different factors that the authors were asking the visitors to tell about themselves. And basically what they do is look at whether you have quite a positive or a negative response to each one of the characteristics that they would have asked the visitors to provide information on. And in this case, it looks like there were positive responses to pretty much everything, and that all these things were quite correlated with each other. So just to give you an example to explain how this works, they asked the people to describe whether they were interested in animals, whether they felt connected to nature, whether they had a good understanding of conservation issues, and also whether they had a history of trying to help with conservation issues, and whether they were familiar with current events associated with them, whether they supported organizations involved in conservation, whether they engaged in it on a daily basis, things like that, whether they were interested in being outdoors. So all of those things were different factors that the visitors were asked to talk about. And it looks like most visitors that were positive on one of those were positive on the rest of them as well, because all of those things were involved in that first principal component, or that first kind of condensed variable arising from this analysis. The second one, the one that looked at emotional responses, found that people who were amused were also attracted to, compassionate about, curious about, feeling love for, feeling respect for, feeling a connection with, and feeling awe of the animals in display. So they were positive about all of those different traits. And finally, for the conservation mindedness one, they found a connection between feeling that the exhibit made conservation issues more meaningful, feeling that the concern of the visitor towards the animals in the enclosure also related to their concern about the well-being of animals in the wild, feeling that the exhibit made the visitor more likely to support conservation in some way, and also to change their own behaviors in some way. So again, people that reported a positive on one of those were generally positive on the rest of them as well. So all of these things kind of interacted as suites of behaviors, where people who were quite emotional about an exhibit in one way were emotional in lots of different ways and for lots of different reasons. Similarly, if they had some kind of inkling of interest in conservation, they expressed it in lots of different ways, and it had to do with caring about the well-being of animals, wanting to support it, wanting to engage in it, wanting to be active in conservation. So all of these things kind of tended to fall out together, which you probably would guess, because most people, when they are quite into animals or into nature, they express that in lots of different ways, and that's basically what these results are reflecting. So, looking at some of the other traits as well, women tended to respond much more emotionally than men, regardless of what species was being viewed. The researchers found to their surprise that age did not strongly impact emotional response, which is one of the things that previous studies had found. People reported that more eye contact with animals was associated with how strongly they felt they kind of interacted with the animals and how good the encounter was. And they also reported that this eye contact had kind of an impact on behavioral diversity. So when they had this kind of one-on-one eye contact connection with the animals that they were watching, they tended to feel that they were overall observing more behavioral diversity in the quarry, if you like. Now, the strength of the encounter was reported as being much higher during the enriched sessions than during the baseline sessions, and that was regardless of species. So basically, all of the time that the animals were being given extra food or extra things to do, that somehow translated into a more positive experience for the visitors themselves. One of the interesting things, though, was that the enrichment did not impact the extent of the eye contact. So even though encounter strength was related to the enrichment sessions, and also eye contact was related to the encounter strength, there wasn't then another association between the thing that kind of connected both of those, enrichment and eye contact. So those were three kind of very diverse things that didn't necessarily intercorrelate amongst themselves. Now, the emotional response, as you might guess, was stronger when the encounters were felt to be stronger. So not just when you had that positive impact with the animal, but also how much of that you then took away with you. So it wasn't just what was happening in the moment, but how long that moment lasted, basically is what that indicates. And also, they felt that the emotional response was stronger when there was more eye contact reported. Emotional responses were influenced by the type of animal being observed, which again is exactly what the authors expected to find. So the tigers had the strongest positive response, but surprisingly there wasn't a big difference between the wild dogs and the hyenas. And they did expect that there would be, because wild dogs are not as well known. Hyenas are pretty well known and they aren't really well liked, and yet the two of those seem to be kind of grouped together for some reason. And I'll talk a little bit more about why the authors think that might have been the case later on. The researchers also found that environmental enrichment did impact behavioral diversity, but that behavioral diversity was not linked to the species. So overall, whenever there was enrichment, the animals were doing more things, which is unsurprising. If you throw a bone in there that they didn't have access to before, they're more likely to kind of chew on the bone and play with the bone, and that's more behavioral diversity than they would have had without that. So again, kind of a no-brainer there. But the interesting thing, I guess, was the fact that the tigers tended to show more behavioral diversity than either of the other two species under the baseline conditions, but under the enrichment conditions, it was the wild dogs that were noticeably more active. So the animals were responding in different ways to the presence of these enriching things within their enclosures. As expected, the effects of enrichment on behavior also went on to influence the emotional responses of visitors. So both also the emotional response and the predisposition of visitors to like nature and like conservation mindedness, these also influenced how people were thinking about conservation after they left the zoo. So the emotional response and the predispositions were positively related to one another, and these also positively impacted the overall feelings about conservation once the experience at the zoo was over. And all of these things kind of cumulatively suggest that there are factors within the zoo settings that can influence how the visitors are experiencing that environment, how happy they are while doing it, how strong that experience is for them, and how that then goes on to influence what they're going to take away from the whole experience and how they're going to feel about nature and animals in general. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail just after the break, but I don't want you to have to listen to me droning on forever, so I'll give you a bit of John Mellencamp singing Emotional Love. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and as I mentioned before the break, that was John Mellencamp with Emotional Love. And on today's show, I'm talking about a recent study that looked at the interaction between visitors' characteristics and attitudes and zoo enclosures and what it is that visitors are looking at, and then how all of that affects how people feel about conservation by the time they leave the zoo. And all of this is really about thinking about what is the role of zoos in modern society. How can zoos reach people? What is the most effective way to get people interested in and informed about wildlife, while also making sure that the wildlife, living within them are quite happy and receiving the kind of stimulation and living in the right kind of habitats that they deserve. So this is all thinking about what is the role of zoos today and how can we make sure that zoos are serving this conservation purpose that so many people seem to suggest that they have. So just before the break, I was talking about the results of this study. Now, just to summarize, what the researchers found was that visitors to the Bronx Zoo reported stronger conservation mindedness when they were already predisposed towards nature and conservation, so not a big surprise, but also when they experienced strong, positive emotional responses to the exhibits that they were looking at the time that they were surveyed. In this case, those were carnivore exhibits: tigers, wild dogs, and hyenas. Now, the strength of their emotional responses to the animals was influenced by several factors, including some things that are just inherent characteristics of the visitors and other things that could be influenced in the zoo setting itself. So things like gender, the species being observed, whether or not they had eye contact with the animals, and also what the animals were doing within the enclosure. And those last couple were in turn influenced by environmental enrichment. So these relationships have the power to influence free choice learning and also, therefore, the conservation attitude that visitors are leaving with when they're all done with their visit. And just as a reminder, free choice learning is not just the stuff that you're picking up from watching the animals in the enclosure, but the things that you're paying attention to that have been placed out for you at those sites. So for example, with the tiger enclosure, they had a bunch of kind of posters up on the wall. They had exhibits where you could go look at a big wall and press some buttons to have interactive displays and interactive experiences. So some people might just pass on by those and just want to look at the animals, but other people might be inspired to go read a bit more, play the videos, play the audio recordings, and get more out of the experience. And of course, all of that stuff is put there for a reason. So the zookeepers want to make sure that you are engaged enough to interact with those things. And so this suggests that there are some things that they can do to influence whether or not you as a visitor are going to go investigate those a bit closer. Now, many people have a strong desire, and even a need in some cases, to be near animals. And that's reflected in the fact that lots of people do pay to visit animals in situations like zoos. And teachers have often reported visiting zoos specifically because they want students to be able to get closer to animals than they otherwise might have, and even in some cases have the chance to touch these individuals. And there are a lot of anecdotal observations of people tapping on glass and doing other sorts of attention-seeking behaviors in zoos and other kind of, even natural settings to try to get animals to interact with them in some way. I've definitely seen this, at the aquarium, at the zoo, and I'm sure if you've gone out to these places, you have as well. And all of these things suggest that people really do want to have some sort of an interaction with animals, even though, it's not necessarily the easiest thing or the safest thing or the most ethical thing to do. We do kind of have this craving of making this contact with nature and with wildlife. And one of the interesting things that was found in this study was that enrichment creates more behaviors. So if you put things into the enclosure for the animals to eat or to play with, they do more things, they are more active, and that can provide a more interesting encounter for the people that have come to watch them. But at the same time, this may also redirect eye contact because the animals might be looking at their toys or their treats, and so they aren't looking at people as much. And so this could actually have the opposite effect. So even though more behaviors are good, less eye contact is bad, and so the two things could potentially cancel each other out to some extent. And the eye contact is really important because people kind of report that it makes them feel as though they're really having a real connection with the animals. And in fact, they're being admitted to the world of the animal and kind of understanding it a bit more, and they're more in the zone with it. So you have to kind of balance out these two different things. Previous studies have also found that people respond quite favorably to obvious attention of animals, or even if the animals aren't paying attention to them, to other people that are standing nearby. So if there's some way to get the animals to kind of glance out every now and then of the enclosure, that would actually be quite a beneficial thing because people do quite like that. Even if there isn't 100% eye contact, if it's just even attention, that's a beneficial thing as well. And of course, we do know that eye contact is not always beneficial for the animals, so you have to be quite cautious in putting that result into action. So maybe you can find a way to use one-way glass, or to ensure that people can see animals looking up but not necessarily are going to look them straight in the eye, because there are lots of species that see that as an aggressive thing, a kind of a challenging maneuver. So I think I've probably told the story before of one of the times that I was in Kenya and accidentally made direct eye contact with a baboon that was sitting on the side of the road. And the moment that it happened, the baboon leapt up and started shrieking at the top of its lungs because it perceived that as a challenge from me. Here I was staring it down because I was trying to assert my authority. And of course that's not how I perceived it at all, but it was quite stressful to the animal. So we have to be careful that we aren't doing this to animals in a zoo, particularly because it's not just one person that they'd be interacting with, but potentially hundreds per day. So we have to make sure that this is a nice experience for both the visitors and the animals themselves. Now, unsurprisingly, tigers provoked the strongest emotional response of all the three species studied. And the tiger enclosure, in addition to having not just, kind of the largest and most aesthetically pleasing animals, it also included cubs. And of course, cubs, people tend to love baby animals. And so this could have been a real driving factor here in this visitor experience difference, because people are attracted to these cute little tiny animals, and so they may have been quite a bit more happy at that enclosure than at the other ones because the cubs were present. Tigers also were the most critically endangered of all the species, and so that could also have had an impact on the visitor response, because you tend to feel a bit luckier when you're in the presence of something that you may never see in the wild and may in fact not be existing in the wild for much longer. One thing that did surprise the authors was the lack of difference in the response towards wild dogs and hyenas. And this may have had to do with where the animals spent their time in the enclosure. So I think I mentioned at the very top of the show that the hyenas tended to be a bit closer to the viewing platform. And so this may have kind of canceled out any negative feelings about them, because the wild dogs may be a bit cooler and a bit more pleasant of a species, but they were far away and so not as accessible. But the hyenas were right there, and so maybe that made them seem a bit more appealing at the time. Also, wild dogs are less familiar, so even though hyenas have kind of a negative reputation sometimes, the fact that they're a known entity might have influenced how people responded to them. And these are the sorts of things that managers should consider when they're designing exhibits that are aiming to maximize visitor experience and also kind of make visitors leave with a certain attitude in mind. So the way that the authors end up their paper is thinking about kind of the interplay between predispositions, emotional response, and also pro-conservation intentions. So what happens between, what you come in with, what you experience while you're there, and then what you leave with? Well, in previous studies, they say that visitors have typically responded more positively to exhibits that actually contained an educational component. So people do tend to like feeling as though they're getting something out of this that they can take away with them. And these same people tended to report higher levels of pro-environmental behavior when they left. And that suggests that conservation mindedness can be facilitated by providing not just a positive emotional experience, but also a mentally stimulating experience while people are at the zoo. So creating for them a habitat where they can have this one-on-one interaction with the animal in some way or another, whether because it's close to you or because you make eye contact or because it's doing some funny behaviors, but also then providing information in that area so that you can pick up some stuff while you're there and actually kind of create some mental padding around that event that you've had. So really put it into context and think about what these animals are, where they live, and really cement those ideas in your head. The researchers also suggest that there's an increasing number of studies that suggest that environmentally responsible behavior will be promoted by positive emotions rather than negative ones. So for example, a lot of the stuff about climate change and about recycling, we tend to kind of focus on negative things like you're going to feel guilty if you don't do this. This is going to be a problem if you don't do this. And so it kind of guilt trips you into doing what you should. But instead, we can create within zoos kind of a happy place where you're using positive experiences to then excite people about doing these very same behaviors. So rather than feeling guilted into not taking a flight because it's too carbon heavy, you can instead think, oh, I love that tiger so much. I know that there is going to be a real problem with habitat change because of the climate, so I'm not going to take that flight because I don't want to contribute to all of the carbon pollution. Now maybe that's a bit of a far-fetched idea, but that's the kind of idea that the authors are hoping might potentially happen on a smaller scale, or perhaps using a bit more kind of accessible characteristics within your own life that you can potentially manipulate in order to contribute to the conservation efforts that they're looking at here. And indeed, zoos can be places where people who already have pro-nature feelings can have them amplified. So you don't necessarily just have to pull in someone and change their mind. You can also pull in someone who already has those kind of thoughts and make those thoughts even stronger or even more cemented, or give them a whole new outlet for those sorts of ideas. Maybe they can learn about a whole new species that needs help, or a whole new thing that they can do in order to contribute to the health of the natural environment. And of course, managers can't change the characteristics that visitors have. They can't change your gender, they can't change whether or not you already have kind of a love of nature, but they can change things that happen there on the day. They can adjust the species that are displayed, the ways in which those displays are set up, and they can kind of foster that kind of environment that helps people have these sorts of experiences. They can also try to stimulate predispositions using effective media and online campaigns and by introducing on-site programs, so things like lectures and symposia that can facilitate learning experiences near animals. So if it's the presence of the animals that makes people receptive to these things and makes them want to engage in those things more often, then you can do those sorts of educational pro-conservation activities within the animal environment. So those are the kind of positive messages that these guys end up their paper with. They're hoping that we can use this information about the emotional responses that people have at zoos to hopefully improve zoo experiences and make people more aware of endangered animals, aware of habitats that need help, and then more likely to go out and actually engage in conservation that can help with both of those goals. And I hope that definitely is something that they're able to achieve with this research and all the other research that's going into figuring out how to make zoos useful in the modern century, and not just kind of a place where we put a bunch of odd animals and keep them behind bars for no real purpose except to just go stare at them, but in fact to learn and to help those animals and to turn around and help the relatives of those animals that are still out in the wild. And on that, I will leave you for the last few seconds with a bit of Justin Townes Earle singing Learning to Cry.